There are crimes that, when committed by those we love the most, hurt 1,000 times more than any betrayal from a stranger. Cordelia never imagined that the person she once cradled in her arms, cared for, and loved unconditionally would be the one to push her into hell. A 78-year-old mother, imprisoned by her own daughter and son-in-law in a basement, walled in with bricks and left to die. This is not a scene from a horror film, but the brutal truth she lived through. 10 years passed. 10 years that Beatrice and Montgomery thought had buried everything, until one warm afternoon, a soft knock echoed on the door. And when it opened, they couldn't believe their eyes. The woman standing there, elegant in a blue dress, with her silver hair neatly combed and eyes that showed no fear. Cordelia had returned. Not for revenge, but to prove that some souls, even when buried, will always find a way to come back to life. This story will make you reflect on motherhood, betrayal, and the extraordinary strength of a woman determined not to die in silence. Because sometimes it is from the deepest abyss that the most beautiful flowers bloom. The house smelled of freshly made stew, the kind that only a mother with years of experience and love in her hands knows how to prepare. Cordelia, with her well-lived 78 years, carefully stirred the wooden spoon over the pot, tasting with the tip of her tongue and smiling with the satisfaction of someone who still feels useful, loved, part of the home. At the table, already set with 3 deep plates, sliced bread, and folded napkins, a thick silence reigned. Beatrice, her only daughter, absently checked her phone without even looking at her mother while watching her serve the soup with that habitual care. Cordelia called her by name. She told her she was very happy that they were together, that she felt fortunate to be able to help with the house, even though she wasn't as quick as before. Beatrice responded with a murmur, without taking her eyes off the screen, as if each word from her mother weighed more than she wanted to acknowledge. Montgomery, the son-in-law, sat heavily in the chair, cleared his throat loudly, and threw out a phrase that fell like a stone in the middle of the table. He said there was no longer room in the house for 3, that things were difficult, and having an elderly person in the house complicated everything, that it wasn't fair to them. Cordelia blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly, and asked with a trembling voice if he was referring to her. Montgomery didn't respond directly, just took the bread, broke it with his hands, and began to eat in silence. For weeks, Montgomery had been pressuring Beatrice about selling the house to pay off his gambling debts. The presence of an elderly woman would complicate any sale, and he had grown desperate as his creditors became more threatening, leaving in the air the feeling that something was about to break. Beatrice, with a forced smile, changed the subject. She told her mother that she knew she'd been having trouble sleeping lately and that she had spoken with a neighbor who recommended some natural pills. She handed her a small white capsule along with a glass of water and assured her it was just to help her rest better, to relax. Cordelia, trusting, nodded sweetly, grateful, without imagining that that night she wouldn't close her eyes for rest, but due to betrayal. She drank the water, swallowed the pill, and little by little began to feel her eyelids heavy, her body warm, and an enveloping fog that stole her strength. Montgomery had already prepared the basement earlier that day while Cordelia was napping, carrying down the shovel, cement mixture, and bricks he had hidden in the garage days before. He turned on the hanging lamp in the basement that swayed with a trembling yellow light and began to prepare the corner. He had marked the exact place where he would raise the wall. It wasn't the first time he had thought about it. Beatrice had insisted for weeks that her mother was no longer useful, that she only took up space, that it would be best if she disappeared, but without leaving traces, without raising suspicions. He had doubted at first, but then agreed, convinced that this way they could sell the house and move, live without burdens, without guilt, as she said. Upstairs, Cordelia struggled to keep her eyes open. She felt dizzy, her body like cotton, sounds increasingly distant. She leaned on the table, murmuring that maybe she needed to lie down for a moment. Beatrice helped her up, held her by the shoulders with feigned tenderness, and told her yes, that she would accompany her to her room. But instead of taking her to her bed, she went down with her by the back stairs, the ones that led to the basement. Cordelia asked why, what they were doing, that this wasn't her room. Beatrice, with a sweet but firm voice, told her not to worry, that everything would be fine. When they reached the basement, Montgomery had already placed the first row of bricks. Beatrice handed him her mother's half-asleep body, and he arranged her on an old mattress in the corner, next to a small lamp and a worn blanket. Cordelia, still confused, tried to speak, to ask, but her tongue dragged slowly inside her mouth. Beatrice crouched next to her, caressed her face, and told her in a whisper that she was sorry, that it wasn't personal, but that she had lived enough, that she should make room. Cordelia opened her eyes with effort, and with the little clarity she had, saw her daughter walking away and her son-in-law beginning to raise the wall. She wanted to scream, but only a groan came from her throat. Montgomery placed brick after brick with quick hands, as if the sooner he finished, the less guilt he would feel. The basement light trembled over their faces while the cement spread between the joints, sealing not only the wall, but the fate of a woman who had only given love. Once the last opening was closed, silence was trapped between the bricks. Upstairs, the house seemed normal again. Beatrice went up breathing deeply and locked the basement entrance. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the sofa while Montgomery washed his hands covered with cement. They said they had done the right thing, that no one would ask about Cordelia, that being elderly, everyone would assume she had gotten lost or died naturally. No one would suspect them. No one would know the truth. In the basement, Cordelia managed to regain some consciousness. She crawled to the wall, knocked with weak knuckles, and screamed her daughter's name, without understanding why. No one answered. Only the echo of her voice returned her anguish. Darkness enveloped her like a cold blanket, and the smell of humidity reminded her that this space hadn't been made for living, but for dying slowly. She closed her eyes, and in that instant, for the first time, she felt real fear, not of death, but of having been abandoned by the one she loved most. And yet, within that fear, a tiny seed of rage, of resistance, began to be born. Cordelia, the woman who had been a mother, wife, worker, who had raised her daughter alone, wasn't ready to give up, not even there between 4 brick walls. Can you imagine that your own child could do something like this to you? You can feel the knot in the chest of a betrayed mother. This story has only just begun. The darkness was so dense it seemed to have weight. Cordelia slowly opened her eyes, but found no light to guide her. She felt her wrists numb, her fingers asleep, and a cold stuck to her body, as if she were inside a tomb without earth. Her breathing was short, irregular, and in her ears still buzzed the echo of something she couldn't quite remember. The floor under her body was damp cement, and a sour humidity rose through her nostrils, mixed with the smell of dust, confinement, and forgetting. When she tried to move, she felt a cramp that ran down her back and let out a small moan. It took her a few seconds to understand that she wasn't in her bed, that she wasn't in her room, and that something wasn't right. She tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her to stay seated, leaning against a freezing wall that scraped her back with its rough texture. She blinked several times, hoping the darkness would clear, but she only heard her own breathing and the absolute silence that enveloped her. It was then that almost by instinct she raised a trembling hand and knocked on the wall with her knuckles. 1, 2, 3 soft knocks, barely audible, but enough to light the fire of fear in her chest. No one answered. The silence continued impassive, as if mocking her. She knocked harder, this time with both hands, desperately, and screamed her daughter's name. First with a broken voice, then with a more acute scream, full of anguish. "Beatrice, Beatrice, please, where are you?" she asked with a thread of voice, begging for an answer, for a sign, for anything that would make her think it was all a bad dream. But no answer came. Only the muffled echo of her own screams hitting against the cement walls. She got up with difficulty, feeling the space with her hands like a blind woman, trying to understand where she was. She touched the cold walls, the humidity, the corners full of dust. The place was small, barely a few square meters, with an old mattress and a blanket that barely covered her legs. There were no windows, no visible doors, just walls and a brutal sensation of confinement. From somewhere above her head, she managed to hear a slight murmur. She stayed still with her ear attentive, and then heard it more clearly. A television on, the sound of a soap opera, or perhaps a newscast mixed with canned laughter. Cordelia felt a stab in her chest when she recognized that she was right below her house, the place where she had lived for years, and that upstairs life continued as if nothing had happened. She screamed louder. She pounded the wall with her fists, clamoring for help, for compassion, for an explanation. She knew the television was on because someone was there, because her daughter and son-in-law were there. She screamed until she ran out of voice, until her hands burned from the blows, until her throat hurt as if she had swallowed fire. And then she heard her. Beatrice's voice didn't come down to the basement, didn't come to see her, but her voice came down like a knife through the invisible cracks of that confinement. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said with a coldness that froze Cordelia's blood. "But you've lived enough." There were no more words, just that. And then the sound of the television turning up as if to silence anything else that might be heard. Cordelia remained motionless with her back against the wall and her eyes wide open, trying to understand if this was real, if her own daughter had really said that to her, if she was really there locked up by her will. The minutes passed like hours. The cold chilled her bones. Her stomach began to hurt, and her mouth was dry as paper. She searched around with her hands and found a small bottle of water that had been left for her, now nearly empty, and crumbs of old bread scattered on the mattress, hard as stone. It was then that she understood that everything had been planned, that it wasn't an accident, that the pill, the mattress, the confinement, everything was prepared. Beatrice had done it intentionally. Montgomery, too. They were upstairs living their lives as if nothing had happened while she was buried alive beneath their feet. Tears began to run down her cheeks uncontrollably, not from fear, but from sadness. A sadness so deep it hurt more than any blow, more than any betrayal. She had raised her daughter alone, had worked since she was young, had sacrificed everything for her. And now she was a burden that had to disappear, one less voice in the house, one less body at the table. Time stopped making sense in there. She didn't know if it was day or night. She didn't know how many hours had passed since she woke up. She only knew that the air was becoming denser, that her body ached from the rigidity of the floor, and that her heart beat with a disordered rhythm as if it also wanted to give up, but it didn't. Despite the pain, despite the silence, Cordelia didn't give up. She remembered her mother, a strong woman who always told her that even in the worst storm, you have to keep your back straight and your gaze firm. She remembered her father who taught her to never stay silent when something was unfair, and she thought that if she had survived so many things, she could also survive this. She began to think, to plan, to observe every corner of the basement, to save strength. She talked to herself, in a low voice so as not to go crazy. She repeated to herself that it wasn't her fault, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she deserved to live. And in that space where the world seemed to have forgotten her, she found something within herself that she didn't know she had, an indestructible will. She thought about her grandson, the boy who barely spoke when she was locked up. Would they tell him his grandmother died? Would they say she disappeared without saying goodbye? Or would they simply erase her name from the story? She wouldn't allow it. She wouldn't let the lie win. She wouldn't die there. And so, in the midst of cold, hunger, abandonment, Cordelia decided she would survive. Not for revenge. Not to punish anyone, but to live, to prove that there are things that can't be buried so easily, not with bricks, not with silence, not with forgetting, because there are souls born to resist. And hers, though wounded, still had much to say. Ezekiel Whitman wasn't a man to meddle in other people's lives, but he also wasn't one to pretend not to see the obvious. He had been living on that same street in Cedar Falls for almost 30 years, in the same cream-colored house he built with his own hands alongside his late wife, Ophelia, a woman of strong character and noble heart, who had left him alone a decade ago. Since then, Ezekiel lived alone with the company of his old books, his battery radio, and a meticulous routine that repeated every day without fail. But for some weeks now, something had begun to disturb that routine. When night fell, when he sat in his armchair with a cup of hot tea, he heard noises that didn't fit with the usual tranquility of the neighborhood. They were dry, muffled sounds, like knocks against a hard surface. Sometimes they seemed like whispers, not clear voices, not articulated words, but an insistent murmur, almost like a lament that the wind carried to his backyard. At first he thought it was some trapped animal, or perhaps the noise of old pipes. Ezekiel had lost his wife Ophelia to cancer 3 years prior, and since then he had become more attuned to sounds of distress, having spent many nights listening to her labored breathing. This sensitivity made him more aware of unusual noises in his quiet neighborhood. But night after night the sounds persisted, always around the same time, always coming from the house next door, the one that belonged to Beatrice, Cordelia's daughter. Ezekiel knew Cordelia well. They had been neighbors for more than 20 years, and although they were never intimate, he always considered her a kind, hard-working woman with a dignity that wasn't lost even on the hardest days. That's why it was strange to him not to have seen her anymore. He thought maybe she was sick or had gone to live with some other family member, but he couldn't help feeling that something didn't fit. Beatrice's house curtains were always closed, even during the day. No one talked about Cordelia, no one asked about her, and Beatrice, when she greeted him, did so with a tense smile, as if carrying a burden she didn't want to show. One night, tired of doubts and pushed by an unease that gave him no peace, Ezekiel decided to approach the neighboring house. It was almost 10 when he crossed the small garden with slow steps. He knocked on the wooden door with his knuckles and waited. Beatrice took a couple of minutes to open. She wore an elegant nightgown, her hair hastily tied back, and an expression of barely disguised annoyance. Ezekiel told her he had heard strange noises for several nights, that he was worried there might be some trapped animal or perhaps some problem with the house structure. Beatrice crossed her arms, frowned, and responded saying it was nothing, that it was surely the dog she had recently adopted, a restless animal that scratched the walls when it heard noises in the street. But Ezekiel remembered clearly that Beatrice's small gray schnauzer had died 6 months earlier, and he had even brought her flowers when she buried the animal in her backyard. Then, with a tight smile, she added that not all neighbors knew how to respect others' privacy and that maybe Ezekiel should worry more about his own things. He, without losing his calm, nodded, apologized for bothering her, and left, although inside something told him that explanation wasn't sincere. What Beatrice didn't know was that Ezekiel perfectly remembered that her dog, a small gray schnauzer, had died more than 6 months ago. He himself had consoled her at the door. He even brought her flowers when he saw her crying in the garden the day they buried the animal in the back of the lot. So no, it wasn't the dog. That much was clear to him. And if it wasn't the dog, then what was it? What was happening in that house? That night, Ezekiel didn't sleep. He stayed by the window with the radio off, listening in silence. At 11:30, like clockwork, the noises began again. 3 dry knocks, then a pause, and then something that wasn't a knock, but a softer, more acute sound, as if someone were dragging their nails across a wooden surface. He stood up, took his flashlight, and went out to the patio. The moon barely illuminated the path, but he knew every corner of his garden. He approached the back of his property, where his wall bordered Beatrice's house, and stayed still with the flashlight off. He crouched down, put his ear to the ground, and what he heard froze his blood. It was crying, not the crying of a child or an animal. It was contained, heartbreaking crying from an elderly woman. It could barely be heard as if it came from the bowels of the earth, but it was there. It wasn't his imagination, it was real. At first he thought he was dreaming, but when he heard his name again among sobs, he felt his legs trembling. "Ezekiel," the voice said. "Ezekiel, help me." He stepped back, sat on the grass, and closed his eyes. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that that voice was Cordelia's, but it was. He had no doubts. He knew her too well. It was her tone, her accent, the way she pronounced words. He didn't understand how, he didn't understand why, but Cordelia was down there, buried. Locked up, alive. His heart beat hard, and for a moment he felt short of breath. How was it possible? What kind of monsters could have done something like this? He went back into his house, locked up, and sat in his armchair. He had to think. He had to do something, but he couldn't act without proof. He knew that if he accused Beatrice without foundation, he could get into trouble, or worse, that she would find out and decide to finish what she had started. He ran his hands over his face, breathed deeply, and promised himself that the next day he would listen again. He would confirm what he had felt. If it was true, if Cordelia was really there, he would get her out of that hell. He didn't know how, but he would do it. Because no human being deserves to be buried alive, because there are things that can't be silenced, and because that woman's voice shouldn't be extinguished like that between bricks and lies. That night, for the first time in years, Ezekiel cried, not from fear, not from rage, but from helplessness, because he understood he was facing a truth too dark to be ignored, and because he knew in the depths of his soul that he was the only person who could do something. Ezekiel didn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned in bed as if each thought pushed him toward the edge, as if the mattress became narrower each time he remembered that voice coming from the ground, that crying that wasn't imagined, that he felt vibrate in his chest like a bell of truth. At 5 a.m, when the sky barely began to clear, he got up quietly, prepared a cup of black coffee, and sat in front of the window. He observed Beatrice's house carefully. Nothing appeared out of place. Everything was in order. The curtains remained closed. The car was still in the driveway. Not a leaf moved. But he knew something dark was hiding behind those walls. Something that no neighbor imagined, something that asked for help from the depths. After a while, he got up with determination. He went to the shed in the back, where he kept the gardening tools, and chose a firm, heavy shovel with a thick wooden handle. Then he took a flashlight, a rope, and a small rusty pick he hadn't used since Ophelia had died. He locked the door, looked at the sky, and murmured with a broken voice that if he was wrong, he was sorry, but if he wasn't, someone had to do something because no one deserves to die in silence. He began to dig in the back of his garden, right where he believed the ground directly bordered Beatrice's basement. At first the earth was compact and humid from recent rains, but Ezekiel had strong hands hardened by years of physical work. And although his back hurt and sweat soaked his shirt, he didn't stop. He dug in silence, without haste but without pause, as if each shovelful were a prayer, a promise of rescue. Hours passed. The sun began to rise, and the heat of the day became unbearable. But he continued, moved by something stronger than reason, the certainty that Cordelia was there, alive, waiting. As the tunnel deepened, his heart beat faster. He had placed the flashlight on the ground, illuminating the narrow path that made its way toward the unknown. His hands were full of dirt, his nails broken, and breathing hurt in his chest, but he couldn't stop. In the middle of the afternoon, when he had already dug almost 2 meters long, the pick hit something hard. He stopped immediately, crouched down, and began to clean with his hands the area where the sound had changed. It was concrete, a wall. He had arrived. He knew that was the place. With his heart racing, he placed a trembling hand on the wall surface and felt a slight vibration, like a subtle tremor coming from the other side. He remained motionless without breathing, with his ear against the wall. Then he heard it, a knock, then another, and then one more. 3 weak but firm knocks. Someone was knocking from inside. Ezekiel held his breath. He wasn't crazy. He hadn't imagined anything. Cordelia was alive. She was there. He breathed deeply, took the shovel with more strength, and knocked 3 times. He waited, and the next second, 3 new knocks answered him, this time a little stronger. He knelt with tears in his eyes and said quietly that he was there, not to worry, that he was going to get her out, that she wasn't alone. From the other side, a muffled sob was the only response. Then he began to break the wall with the pick. He struck again and again with heavy but precise movements, as if he knew every second counted. The concrete cracked, and with each piece that fell, anxiety increased. He was so close he could feel desperation piercing through the wall. The air became dense, dusty, and the flashlight began to flicker, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He knew he shouldn't. After working for hours with the pick and shovel, he managed to create an opening large enough. Years of moisture and settling had created small cracks in the foundation, which Ezekiel's persistent efforts gradually widened, though the rescue mission remained extremely difficult. Then, as if life exploded in his face, he saw a pair of tearful, tired eyes, but full of something that hadn't gone out. Hope. Cordelia was there, on her knees, with a dirty face, sunken cheeks, dry lips, but alive. She extended her arms toward him and fell against his chest without saying a word at first. Just sobs, just a trembling that ran through her whole body. Ezekiel held her carefully, wrapped her in his arms, and murmured that it was over, that everything had passed, that she would never be alone again. She, still clinging to him like a lost child who finally finds refuge, said through tears that she thought she would die there, that every night she said goodbye to the world, that she didn't understand how someone to whom she gave life could bury her like that, as if she were worth nothing. Ezekiel caressed her hair, helped her out of the hole, and carried her in his arms through the tunnel to his garden. The afternoon sun burned Cordelia's eyes, accustomed to darkness. But it also returned something she thought was lost, the feeling of being alive. When stepping on the grass, she stopped for a moment, bent down, and touched the earth with her hands. She said she didn't know how to thank him, that she had no words, that he had been her angel. Ezekiel replied that she didn't need to thank anything, that he did it because it was right, because no one deserves to be treated like a shadow. They entered his house. He prepared sugar water for her, a wet towel to clean herself, and clothes from his late wife. While she drank slowly, he told her they wouldn't do anything hasty, that they would rest that night and then decide what to do, but that she would never suffer again. Cordelia looked into his eyes and at that moment knew that not all humans were capable of cruelty, that goodness still existed in this world, that there was hope. And so, in the midst of pain, betrayal, and broken silence, a new bond was born, deep, unbreakable. Because when a life is saved with one's own hands, there's no going back. Because sometimes the deepest darkness can give way to the purest light. And because when the heart refuses to give up, even the most solid concrete can be defeated. That night, while the sky dressed in indifferent stars and silence enveloped the street with deceptive calm, Ezekiel prepared a hot infusion for Cordelia, who was wrapped in a thick blanket, sitting in the dining room armchair, as if she still couldn't quite believe she was free. Her body, though fragile, began to regain some color, and in her eyes fear still trembled, but something new also shone, something that hadn't completely gone out. Ezekiel, with his heart still agitated by everything he had experienced, sat in front of her with his elbows on his knees and his gaze fixed on his hands, and told her they should go to the police, that it was just to report Beatrice and Montgomery, that they couldn't go unpunished after what they had done to her. Cordelia listened to him in silence and then, with a soft but firm voice, responded saying, no, that it wasn't the moment yet, that everyone believed she was dead, and that maybe it was best to let them continue believing it. She said that if she returned like that, without proof, without strength, she would only manage to be treated as crazy, and that she had no energy to fight with a system that so many times ignored women like her, that first she needed to breathe, recover her soul, find herself again before facing the world that had forgotten her. Ezekiel nodded with regret. He didn't agree, but he understood. He saw in Cordelia's eyes not only the suffering of having been buried alive, but also the weight of an entire life, giving everything for a daughter, who in the end decided to get rid of her as if she were old furniture. That wound wouldn't heal with legal justice, at least not yet. The next day they got up early before the sun came up completely, and he helped her change, wash her face, collect the few objects she still preserved. They decided the best thing would be for her to stay with him for a while in his house, the one he once shared with his wife and which now had space, silence, and a peace he hadn't felt again since Ophelia died. No one asked about her. No one came looking for her. Beatrice, believing her plan had worked, didn't raise suspicions. Everything continued its course, as if the earth had swallowed Cordelia. And in a way it had, but not as they expected. Ezekiel got some old documents from his deceased wife and helped Cordelia adopt a new name. They spent weeks carefully creating her new identity, using Ophelia's old papers as a foundation. Ezekiel had connections from his construction work who helped with the documentation process, ensuring everything was legal and untraceable. Now she was called Iris, and although at first it was hard for her to respond when someone called her that, with time she began to get used to it, to make that name her own as a symbol of a second chance. No one in the neighborhood suspected. Ezekiel, who was always reserved, simply said that an old friend of his wife was keeping him company for a while. No one asked questions, no one inquired. Sometimes invisibility isn't a condemnation, but salvation. Iris began to go out little by little to the garden, to water the plants, to walk through the house halls with more security. Every morning she sat by the window to watch the sunrise and told herself she was alive, that she was still here, and that was enough for now. The days passed slowly, but restorative. Ezekiel treated her with silent tenderness, without compassion, with that respect that only good men know how to offer. He didn't ask her about what she had lived through if she didn't want to talk. He only offered her his company, his time, his patience. And she, who had spent so much time believing her voice no longer mattered, began to recover the need to speak, to tell, to remember without crying. One day, while they were making tamales together in the kitchen, Cordelia told him she had learned to see things differently, that perhaps, in some strange way, being in that basement had forced her to look inside herself, to face everything she didn't want to see for years, that she had lived denying many truths, justifying absences, excusing Beatrice's coldness, thinking that with love everything could be healed. But love, she said while stirring the dough with her wrinkled hands, also wears out if not cared for. And sometimes the greatest pain isn't what others inflict on you, but what you cause yourself by expecting what won't come. Ezekiel took her hand and told her he admired her strength, that few people would survive what she had gone through with that dignity. Cordelia smiled and responded, saying she didn't feel strong, but that she was learning not to be ashamed of her scars, that she no longer wanted to hide, but to be herself again, or at least a version of herself that could walk without fear. And it was in that instant, in that modest kitchen with the smell of corn and coffee, where for the first time she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, a deep, silent peace that didn't come from justice, forgiveness, or forgetting, but from knowing herself alive, whole, awake. And along with that, peace was also born a soft but constant fire, a thirst to be reborn, to rebuild her story with other words, with other landscapes. Iris, or Cordelia, began to write in an old notebook. Every night she noted what she felt, what she remembered, what she dreamed. Sometimes they were loose phrases, sometimes letters she would never send, sometimes just drawings of flowers and birds. Ezekiel gave her a small plant in a pot and told her that every day she watered it, she should think about how much she could still flourish. She looked at him with tenderness and told him that he had also flourished in her life, like an unexpected surprise, like a light at the end of the tunnel. They laughed together, cooked, listened to old music, and little by little the past began to hurt less, not because they forgot it, but because they decided not to let it define their present. Sometimes, at night, Cordelia got up silently and walked to the edge of the garden. She looked toward Beatrice's house with the lights off and thought about how easy it is for some to erase those who gave them life. But she didn't feel hatred. She didn't feel resentment, just a deep sadness, like a well that no longer tries to fill. And she told herself it wasn't about revenge, that she didn't want to return to destroy, but to demonstrate that no one can bury someone born to rise. So the months passed, and what began as a hiding place became a new home. Ezekiel and Cordelia shared the days like two souls who, having lost so much, had learned to value the essential: company, respect, simple laughter. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman in the process of rebirth, a flower sprouting in fertile soil, a story that hadn't finished being written. And although no one else knew it, she knew that her return, when it came, wouldn't be a scandal. It would be a lesson. It would be proof that the soul, when it refuses to die, always finds a way back. The days at Ezekiel's house began to take on a slow pace, as if time, in some strange way, had allied with them to heal the wounds that couldn't be seen, those that don't bleed but burn inside. Every morning he got up before the sun, prepared pot coffee with a touch of cinnamon, swept the patio calmly, and looked at the garden with the tranquil gaze of someone who no longer expects anything but begins to find peace in small rituals. Cordelia, still getting used to the name Iris, gradually emerged from her own shadow. There was something in Ezekiel's way of living that gave her breath back, something in his serene silence, in his firm hands that didn't tremble whether holding a flower or grasping a hoe, that made her feel safe, unhurried, without judgment. One day, while he was pruning some bushes in the back, he called her with a soft voice and said he had something to show her. She approached curiously, wiping her hands with her apron, and he showed her how to cut flowers without damaging them, how each plant has its rhythm, its space, its way of breathing. He explained that some open to the sun immediately, and others take days to trust. Cordelia watched him while he spoke, while he caressed the leaves with the delicacy of someone who has lived much and learned that everything fragile deserves respect. And without realizing it, she began to feel something she thought was forgotten: tenderness. From that day they shared every morning between earth and flowers. Cordelia discovered she liked talking to the plants, singing to them softly while watering them. And Ezekiel limited himself to listening from the wooden bench under the lemon tree with that peaceful smile that drew itself effortlessly. Sometimes they talked about simple things: recipes, childhood memories, neighborhood stories. Other times the silence between them said more than words. One afternoon, while looking for some old pots in the tool room, Cordelia found a locked metal box. Ezekiel stood still, hesitated for a moment, and then opened it. Inside were papers, deeds, stock certificates, yellowed documents that spoke of properties in the country, land he had inherited from his father, bank accounts he had never touched. She looked at him surprised and asked why he lived with such humility having all that. He replied, shrugging, that money wasn't his compass, that he had already seen enough to know that what's important can't be kept in a safe. He said that true wealth was being able to sleep peacefully, eat with pleasure, have someone to share afternoon coffee with. Cordelia remained silent for a long time, caressing the edges of the box, feeling a mixture of admiration and affection she couldn't hide. Tears formed in her eyes that had no sadness, but gratitude. She told him she had never known a man like that he was teaching her a way of living she didn't know existed, and without saying more, she took his hand firmly, decisively, like someone who finds something they don't want to let go. Ezekiel, without saying a word, gently squeezed her fingers and kissed the back of her hand with respect. It was there, in that simple gesture, where love began. Not a novel love, not one of exaggerated promises. It was a quiet love, of long looks, of walking together without talking, of sharing silence without feeling alone. They didn't need more. They didn't want more. With the passing months, their bond became increasingly evident. The neighbors began to comment that Ezekiel's friend already seemed part of his house, that they looked happy, that old Ezekiel, the same one who walked alone for years, now whistled while sweeping. But no one asked too much, and they liked that. They lived in their own world, without labels or explanations. One day, while preparing a special meal together for Cordelia's birthday, he asked if she would want to marry him. She, who was cutting onion at that moment, dropped the knife and looked at him with big, surprised eyes. Ezekiel told her they didn't need papers, or a party, or church, that he just wanted the world, even if secretly, to know she was his companion, his home. Cordelia didn't answer immediately. She walked to him, hugged him around the waist, and said yes, that she wanted to, that she had felt his for a long time. They married in the garden one Sunday morning with a retired judge who was Ezekiel's friend, a bouquet of flowers from the garden, and 2 simple rings he had made with gold from an old ring. There was no music or photographers, just them, the song of birds, and the scent of jasmine. Cordelia wore a white dress she had fixed herself, simple but beautiful. And Ezekiel wore a clean guayabera and a wide-brimmed hat. At the end of the small ceremony, they looked into each other's eyes, and she told him with a trembling voice that he had rescued her from hell, that when she no longer believed in anything, he appeared with a shovel and a flashlight and gave her back her life. She told him she would love him to heaven, to where there would be no more pain or darkness. Ezekiel caressed her face and promised that as long as he breathed, she would never again be cold or afraid. That night, while they sat watching the sky from the rocking chair, he told her that each star was proof that there's still light in the darkest night. Cordelia, resting on his shoulder, closed her eyes and thought that maybe everything she had lived, however cruel, had led her to that moment, to that quiet corner where love didn't make noise but was felt in every gesture, because there are loves that don't need to shout, loves that heal in silence. Loves that flourish among ruins and build from the remains. And theirs, without doubt, was one of those. The afternoon sun fell heavily on the streets of Cedar Falls, tinting the rooftops with a golden shine that seemed taken from an old postcard. It was one of those days where everything seemed calm, as if nothing bad could happen. The heat from the pavement rose to the windows, and in the houses you could hear everyday sounds: the hum of the fan, the murmur of a television on, the tinkling of dishes after lunch. But that calm was suddenly interrupted by the arrival of a vehicle that didn't go unnoticed. A black limousine, long and gleaming, slowly stopped in front of a modest house with a white facade and red tiles. A house like any other in the neighborhood, except for the fact that this house kept a secret so dark it had tried to bury it forever. The neighbors who were sweeping the sidewalks or watering plants stopped to look. It wasn't common to see a car like that in this neighborhood. Curtains moved subtly. Someone whispered that maybe it was a visit from politicians or some artist, but no one could imagine what was about to happen. The rear door of the vehicle opened slowly, and from inside stepped an elderly woman with slow but sure steps, leaning on a dark wooden cane with hand-carved details. She wore a sky-blue dress that waved with the light afternoon wind, and her hair, completely white, was styled with an elegance that didn't seek to show off, but to command respect. It was Cordelia, but she was no longer the thin, tired, frightened woman who had been rescued from the basement years before. Now her eyes shone with serenity. Her back was straight like someone rebuilt from the foundations, and her walk, though supported by the cane, didn't tremble. Beside her, a man dressed in a light suit with a folder in his hand walked in silence. He said nothing. It wasn't necessary. Cordelia stopped in front of the gate of her old house, the one she knew stone by stone, and looked at it as if seeing an old grave. She breathed deeply, closed her eyes for a second, and then advanced to the main door. Her cane sounded against the cement like a clock marking the passage of time. She reached the doorbell and pressed it once. Inside the house, the sharp sound of the doorbell was heard. In the kitchen, a young man about 13 years old, thin, with tousled hair and headphones hanging from his neck, got up curiously. He walked to the door, opened it slowly, and upon seeing the lady standing in front of him, frowned, confused. Cordelia looked at him with a sweetness that needed no words. He asked with a voice still in transformation who she was, and she, without taking her eyes off his, told him she was his grandmother. The boy remained silent for a few seconds, as if not knowing if he was hearing correctly, and then shouted inside that there was a strange lady at the door saying she was his grandmother. Cordelia remained still, waiting. Her hands didn't tremble. Her lips were closed calmly. Inside the house, footsteps were heard quickly, almost like a nervous run. And then Beatrice appeared in the doorframe with a cup of hot coffee in her hands and her cell phone pressed to her ear. Upon seeing the woman in front of her, her eyes opened like plates. Her skin paled in seconds, and the cup fell from her hands, shattering on the floor into 1,000 pieces. The dark liquid spread across the tiles like a stain that couldn't be hidden. Beatrice tried to speak, but her tongue stuck to her palate. She looked at Cordelia like someone seeing a ghost, like someone who doesn't understand if they're dreaming or living a nightmare. Cordelia said nothing immediately, just observed her with her head slightly tilted, with that mother's gaze that has seen everything, felt everything, and still doesn't break. Finally she spoke, and her voice was stronger than any scream. She told her she thought she would never see that door again, that she would never again step on that threshold, but that life takes turns no one expects, and that she had returned not to seek revenge, but to close the cycle that others thought they had buried. Beatrice stepped back, murmuring that it couldn't be, that it was impossible, that she had, and she was left speechless. The boy looked at both without understanding, not knowing what role he played in that scene. Cordelia looked at him and told him tenderly that it wasn't his fault, that he didn't have to carry others' sins, that sometimes adults do things children can't understand, but that doesn't define who they are. Behind Cordelia, the man in the suit stepped forward and said the lady intended to buy the property, that she had made a very generous offer at double the current value, and that the documents were ready if they wanted to proceed. Beatrice didn't know what to say. She looked at the lawyer, then at Cordelia, then at the floor wet with spilled coffee, and finally turned around without saying a word. Cordelia didn't stop her, didn't call her, didn't need to. She had already said everything with her mere presence. The young man remained at the door mute, as if the scene escaped his grasp. And Cordelia smiled at him, winked, and told him that when he wanted, she would tell him a story, one that began with flowers and ended with freedom. Then, without more, she turned around, elegantly got into the limousine, and while the engine started, she looked through the window one last time at that house that was once her prison and would soon be hers again, but no longer as a home, but as a symbol that there are battles won just by remaining standing. The streets continued their course. People returned to their routines, but those who saw that scene that day knew they had witnessed something more than a visit. They had seen the return of a woman who, against all odds, returned from darkness not with hatred, but with dignity. A woman who didn't scream, who didn't hit, who didn't seek to destroy, but to show that true power lies in resisting without losing one's soul. And that woman dressed in blue, cane in hand, head high, was living proof that self-love is the most silent but also most powerful form of justice. The air inside the house had become thick, almost unbreathable. Beatrice remained paralyzed in the middle of the hallway, with the coffee remains scattered at her feet, not knowing whether to advance or hide behind the nearest wall. Montgomery, who was in the living room reviewing some work papers, got up upon hearing the crash of the broken cup and walked toward the entrance with an annoyed gesture, asking what had happened now. Upon reaching the door, he saw Cordelia standing with her firm cane, dressed in that blue dress that seemed to shine brighter than the wall paint. And for a moment his face became distorted. He recognized her instantly, although the years had given her an air of grandeur she had never shown before, as if that woman who had been submissive and quiet was now made of steel. He asked in a low voice how it was possible, if she hadn't died, if she hadn't gone away forever. Cordelia didn't respond immediately. She limited herself to looking at the man who once helped seal her alive behind a wall, and then turned her face toward the lawyer accompanying her, giving him a subtle signal. The lawyer, a young but confident man, stepped forward with his folder in hand and with a clear, measured voice announced that Mrs. Cordelia Hartwell, present at that moment, had the formal intention of acquiring the property where they were located, and that she was not only offering market value, but double the estimated price with funds available and ready for immediate closing. He said he brought the documents in order, the necessary notarial signatures, and that if the current owners were willing, they could proceed immediately with the transaction. Montgomery let out an incredulous laugh, half-choked, like someone who doesn't know if they're facing a joke or a trap. He asked what kind of game this was, if someone was recording them, if this was some kind of revenge disguised as business. But Beatrice said nothing. She continued trembling with her eyes fixed on her mother, as if Cordelia's mere presence unearthed every sleepless night, every lie she had sustained, every time she repeated to herself that her mother would never return. The teenager, still at the entrance, observed everyone in silence. There was neither rejection nor fear in his face. Just deep curiosity, the kind only young people have when they still don't fully understand pain, but sense they're witnessing something important. He looked at the lady in the blue dress with attention, and without knowing why, felt he wanted to know her. Cordelia held his gaze with intact tenderness, as if in that instant all the pain of the past shrank before the possibility of a new bond. She asked him what his name was, and he responded that it was Jasper, with a shyness that colored his cheeks. She told him he had the same eyes she had when she was a child, and that he wasn't to blame for anything, that what happens between adults is sometimes like a storm one can't stop, but even so, one can choose not to repeat it. Montgomery, trying to compose himself, asked why Cordelia would want to buy precisely that house. After everything that had happened there, she responded with a disturbing calm that made him seem more nervous, saying it was because it was her house, that there she had raised her daughter, cooked hundreds of times, cleaned every corner with love, and that if anyone deserved to recover it, it was her. She said she didn't want to live there, that her life was now different, but that she needed to step on those floors again with freedom, as a symbol that no one can take away a woman's history. Beatrice swallowed with difficulty and finally murmured that she didn't know what to say. Cordelia stepped closer, looked at her with the hard sweetness of a wounded mother, and told her she didn't need to say anything, that silence also spoke and that she had learned to listen to it. The lawyer opened the folder, placed the purchase documents on an improvised table, and slid them toward Cordelia. She took the pen with firm hands, without hurry, and wrote her name with clear, sure letters under the line that said buyer. The sound of the pen on paper was like an act of justice in itself. Then the lawyer turned the document toward the current owners. Montgomery, still confused, took the pen with doubts, looked at Beatrice, searched for some sign of opposition, but she only nodded with downcast eyes. He signed. Then she did the same, without looking at her mother, like someone surrendering, not from defeat, but from recognition. When Cordelia held the copy of the contract with her printed name, her full surname, her signature at the bottom of the page, she felt a current of strength run through her body. She pressed the paper against her chest for a second and then stored it in her purse with the delicacy of someone keeping a relic. She looked around the house like someone saying goodbye, not with sadness, but with satisfaction. She said she didn't know what she would do with the place yet, that maybe she would leave it empty or perhaps open it for something that would serve others, but that decision she would make later, when her heart was ready. The lawyer accompanied her to the door, followed by the uncomfortable silence of Beatrice and Montgomery and Jasper's attentive gaze. Cordelia stopped before leaving and turned one last time toward her daughter. She told her she held no resentment, that this didn't mean she forgot, but that she decided to let go of hatred so as not to carry what didn't correspond to her, that her forgiveness wasn't for her, but for herself. Beatrice didn't answer. She remained standing with tight lips and eyes full of something even she couldn't identify. Cordelia went outside, breathed deeply, and walked toward the limousine with the same dignified step with which she had arrived. When the vehicle started, Jasper remained watching how his grandmother moved away, that woman who seemed to have stepped out of a book, that figure who defied death with elegance. In his mind, something awakened, a seed of questions, a new story began to germinate, and inside the car, Cordelia closed her eyes for a moment and whispered to herself that this was the true victory. Having returned, having resisted, having written her name again with life. The house, now in Cordelia's hands, had become something completely different from what it once was. It was no longer that place where a woman was reduced to silence behind a brick wall, nor the scene where blood ties were broken by ambition. With time, it was transformed into a space that spoke, that told what many preferred to forget. Cordelia didn't want to modify it completely. She didn't tear down the past, but integrated it, faced it, left it exposed. One of the first decisions she made after signing the deed was to return to the basement, that dark corner where she had been locked up by her own daughter and condemned to disappear without a trace. Accompanied by trusted masons, she asked them to remove part of the wall that Montgomery had built with such precision years before. Not all of it, just a section, as if the rest still had to remain as a mute witness to the betrayal. When the workers broke the bricks and exposed the crack through which Ezekiel had rescued her, Cordelia stood observing for long minutes in silence. Her breathing was deep. Her eyes didn't cry, but her face was charged with an emotion that couldn't be disguised. She touched the wall with a trembling hand, feeling the roughness of the old cement, the cold that still emanated from that corner. She said that place would no longer be her grave, but her reminder that no one has the right to silence another's life. She had a simple bronze plaque made, aged, with firm letters that said without beating around the bush what had happened there. The text wasn't long, but it said everything. Here they tried to bury me, but I returned to live. She placed it right on the wall, at eye level, where anyone who went down to the basement could see it without lowering their head. She didn't do it as an act of revenge, but of truth, because stories that aren't told tend to repeat themselves, and she knew her experience, however painful, could serve others. The house was cleaned, fixed, and carefully conditioned. It wasn't filled with ornaments, nor turned into a museum. It remained a house with its rooms, kitchen, patio full of plants, but also with new energy, as if each object now had a second meaning. Cordelia decided to open its doors once a week, not as an attraction or denunciation, but as an act of memory. Every Saturday morning she received whoever wanted to hear her story. Elderly women, students, curious neighbors, even tourists who had heard the rumor that in that house lived a woman who had returned from death. She herself was the one who told the facts. She didn't dramatize, didn't exaggerate, spoke with a firm voice, with pauses that invited reflection. She said her daughter wasn't a monster, but someone who chose selfishness. She said the greatest pain wasn't the confinement, but the betrayal, that she had learned that one doesn't choose the family they're born into, but does decide what kind of person they want to be in the face of adversity. Sometimes at the end of the visit, she sat in the patio and answered questions. Other times, she just offered coffee and silence. Not everyone was prepared to listen, but those who did left different. The house, without seeking it, became a meeting point. People who had been hurt found comfort knowing someone had survived. Others simply learned not to judge, to look beyond appearances. Cordelia never charged admission, never asked for anything in return. She said sharing what she had lived was her way of giving meaning to so much pain. Jasper, her grandson, began going every Saturday, at first with shyness, not knowing if he was welcome. But Cordelia from the first moment told him the doors were always open for him, that it didn't matter what his parents did, that he had the right to his own story. The boy, still at the age of discovering the world, began asking questions, listening attentively. He didn't always understand everything, but his presence was constant. He helped sweep the patio, prepare chairs for visitors, even read some fragments from the notebook where Cordelia had written her memories during the first months after rescue. Over time, he began calling her grandmother without fear, with real affection. And she, although she didn't say it out loud, felt that this small relationship was the gift she hadn't expected to receive. Through Jasper, Cordelia understood that the cycle didn't have to repeat, that the love denied by a daughter could be reborn in the clean gaze of a grandson who just wanted to understand. One afternoon, while they were fixing the garden together, Jasper asked her why she didn't tear down the entire basement wall. Why leave something so ugly in sight? Cordelia replied, saying that wounds don't heal by hiding them, but by looking at them head-on, that the wall wasn't just cement, but testimony. She said she didn't want anyone else to be buried inside without the world knowing that silence is abuse's best accomplice. The boy nodded thoughtfully and told her that when he grew up, he wanted to be someone who helped others, someone who didn't stay silent. Cordelia caressed his head tenderly and told him he was already achieving it just by being there, just by choosing to be. The house continued its course, as if time also somehow healed the walls. But the basement, that small space underground, preserved its shadow, its truth. Every Saturday, the morning light went down the stairs and touched the bronze plaque, making it shine for a few seconds, like a lighthouse. And every time someone new read it, they felt something inside them move. Because there are stories that don't need to shout to shake. There are truths that, though buried, always find a way to surface. And Cordelia, with her cane, her serene gaze, and her voice without trembling, was living proof that even the deepest roots can break concrete if they refuse to die. Time had continued its course with strange calm, as if life had tired of great crashes and now moved to the slow and serene rhythm of Cordelia's steps through the house. Every Saturday the doors remained open, visits arrived, murmurs traveled the walls, gazes stopped in front of the basement wall and stayed there a few minutes longer than necessary, as if seeking to understand something that couldn't be explained with words alone. Jasper continued helping, now with more initiative, more questions, more commitment. The relationship between grandmother and grandson had been woven with invisible but firm threads. And although they never spoke directly about Beatrice, her name sometimes floated in the air like a distant echo that no one named out of respect, prudence, or simply because the pain still didn't know how to come out without breaking something. Cordelia lived in peace, a peace won through struggle, with scars, with stolen years and others reconstructed with her own hands. But although she didn't say it out loud, there was a part of her heart that still kept a crack, one that didn't heal with justice or flowers, because no matter how much one tries, there are loves that when broken, leave splinters impossible to remove. And that love was a mother's love. Beatrice never again touched that door after the day the papers were signed. She never looked for her, never asked for forgiveness. She lived in the same city, a few blocks away, but it seemed an entire ocean separated them. Neighbors spoke little, some out of discretion, others from fear, others because they simply didn't know how to approach such a heavy story. Cordelia expected nothing. She said she had let go of resentment, that forgiveness didn't depend on the other person, but on oneself, that carrying hatred was like drinking poison, expecting the other to get sick. But deep down, in the depths of her soul, it still hurt, because it wasn't about revenge, but absence, that hole that remains when someone you love decides to disappear you without looking back. One Sunday morning, when the sun barely began to gild the garden pots and the bird song wasn't yet interrupted by street noise, Cordelia found an envelope on the ground, right in front of the door. There was no doorbell, no knocks, no notices, just that white envelope, without sender, with her name written by hand, with handwriting that needed no introduction. She knew perfectly who had left it. She bent down carefully, picked it up, and held it in her hands, as if it weighed more than the entire world. She didn't open it immediately, carried it with her to the kitchen, prepared her coffee like every morning, and only when the cup was served did she sit at the table and tear the edge gently, almost with fear. Inside was a single old photograph with edges yellowed by time. Her and Beatrice years ago, sitting in the house garden, right in that same garden that now bloomed again. In the image, Cordelia held a bouquet of flowers, and her daughter hugged her from behind with her cheek resting on her shoulder. It was one of those photos someone takes without thinking that one day it would be the only proof that there was tenderness. Behind the image, with the same handwriting as the envelope, was a single phrase written in blue ink: "Thank you for not closing the door on me." Cordelia stared at that line as if it were a riddle. She read it several times as if wanting to understand everything that wasn't said. There was no "I'm sorry," no "I was wrong," no "forgive me." Just that silent, timid thank you that arrived late but still knocked softly, right where the wound continued breathing. She didn't cry, didn't smile immediately, just placed the photograph on the table next to the cup and remained observing it like someone conversing with a ghost. She told it quietly that she didn't know what had made Beatrice take that step, that she didn't understand if it was repentance, nostalgia, or guilt, but that somehow that small gesture reminded her that even the most broken souls sometimes seek to return. That day she didn't open the house to the public. She put a small sign on the door that said, "Closed for today. Thank you for your understanding." Jasper arrived later, as always, and seeing the sign asked if everything was all right. Cordelia replied yes, that she needed to rest a little, that sometimes the heart also asks for a pause. He nodded without asking more questions, and together they sat in the garden to drink lemonade without saying much, just sharing the silence. The sun caressed their faces, and the plants seemed to move with their own rhythm, as if they also breathed slower that day. Cordelia looked at her grandson and thought about how much he had given back to her, what it meant to be able to see in his eyes a hope that was no longer in her daughter, but still lived in her blood. As the light of the day gradually fades, Cordelia smiles, not because she has found the answers to every question, but because, in that moment, she understands that life doesn't always go the way we expect, yet it always finds a way to bring peace. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken, nor does it require empty promises or grand gestures. It comes from silence, from the blurry photos of time, from short stories that are deep enough to make us reflect. Perhaps, just perhaps, life can return in ways we never expected, like a crack in the heart of a porcelain cup revealing light. When Cordelia closed the door, it wasn't out of exhaustion, but because she had felt the strength in everything she had overcome. A woman once torn between the past and the present, she now understands that freedom isn't about escaping pain, but living with it, learning to make peace with it, and turning it into a part of herself. Perhaps today is the moment she has found a small piece of happiness, even if it's just a streak of light in the dark, a life that seemed to have lost everything, but can be reborn once again. So, if you are here, do you feel something like Cordelia? Is it the unexpected return after the storm, a hopeful glance after everything has calmed down? Or is it the silent forgiveness, gentle as the breath of someone who has understood that everything can become a part of them. Surely each of us has our own story, our own cracks in the soul that only we know. But if you'd like to share your story, I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment below the video to continue exploring stories that touch the hearts of each person. People like you, with sensitive, deep, and generous hearts, always make the story more meaningful. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to journeying with you on the next chapter.